Breaking news, everybody. The next live edition of Seacoast Stories is happening at 7 o'clock on Thursday, June 19th at the Word Barn in Exeter. It's happening outdoors in the meadow, and the beautiful Seacoast sun will set while I talk to my guests. I'll be joined by three very special people. First up is Jay Collins of Flight House Gym, our most popular guest of Season 2. And then it's Alyssa Pine, the fearless leader of the Live Freely Market in Hampton. And in our main event, I will finally speak to Joe Kelly, the assistant mayor of Portsmouth and the owner of Cup of Joe downtown. Plus, Kira Liu of WOKQ will co-host our Seacoast Trivia, where three lucky audience members will get to compete for special Seacoast prizes. We sold out weeks before our last event, so to guarantee your spot, I suggest you get your tickets now by visiting the link in the show notes. More to come in the coming weeks, but for now, let's start the show. Welcome to Seacoast Stories, a podcast about the people, businesses, and newsmakers that make the Seacoast an American hidden gem. I'm Troy Farkas, and on today's episode, the stunning underdog story of how three Durham women stopped the world's richest man from destroying the Seacoast. No, we're not talking about Elon Musk, but instead, we're headed to the vault. Here is what you need to know. In 1973, the world's richest man, Greek shipping legend Aristotle Onassis, wanted to build an oil refinery in our backyard at Durham Point, which is seated close to the Oyster River, Great Bay Estuary, and Piscataqua River. For a landmark, it's not far off from Wagon Hill and Emery Farms today. Now, in the 1970s, the U.S. found itself in a crisis. Because the country had expressed support for Israel, the oil-rich Arab countries placed an embargo on the U.S. as retribution, which decreased the supply and increased the demand so much that President Nixon had to deploy rations where, for example, if you had an odd number at the end of your license plate, you could only get gas on Monday, Wednesday, or Friday. Even numbers on Tuesday, Thursday, Saturday, and Sunday. And sometimes you could only get 2 to 3 gallons at a time. It's like the COVID toilet paper crisis on steroids. So, in a quest to make New Hampshire more reliant on its own resources, then-Governor Meldrum Thompson dreamt of building an oil refinery in the state. William Loeb, the conservative publisher of the Manchester Union Leader, the state's largest newspaper at the time, he also wanted it. So when Onassis expressed an interest in building a refinery, the three power brokers formed a trio to make their dreams become a reality. Except, they underestimated the citizens of the Seacoast, who, for the most part, vehemently opposed this refinery. And this fight against these three powerful men was led largely by three powerless women. Dudley Dudley, yes, that's her real name, Nancy Sandberg, and Phyllis Bennett. Mind you, this is 1973, and while women were beginning to make strides in their fights for equality, they were still largely confined to the home and to their husbands. The story you're about to hear is a remarkable story about corruption, activism, environmentalism, power abuse, media manipulation, women's progress, and scandal. And it is told by Professor David W. Moore, a senior fellow at the Carsey School of Public Policy at UNH, and also the author of the book, Small Town, Big Oil, the untold story of the three women who took on the world's richest man and won. This episode is presented by Meconi Financial Management and Holistic and Hormonal. And if you were wondering, because I didn't know this, what an oil refinery is, it's a large system that takes raw oil and then converts it into gasoline and heating oil so that we can then use it to power our cars, homes, and factories. But before we get to that part of the story, let's start with the juicy stuff. Because shortly before this whole ordeal happened, Onassis married Jackie Kennedy. That's JFK's widow, like the apple of everyone's eye. This is definitely not an apples to apples comparison, But imagine that President Trump was killed in Pennsylvania last summer, and that, say, a year from now, Melania Trump turns around and marries Jeff Bezos. Imagine the headlines and the scandal. That is the level of fame and celebrity and wealth that we are dealing with here. And it is all related to this little slice of heaven we call the Seacoast. Okay, enough for me. I'm getting passionate and I'm nerding out. Here's Professor Moore.
Well, to understand the Kennedy relationship with Onassis, you really have to go back to the post-World War II, because at that point, Bobby Kennedy was an attorney, and he worked with him at the time, and they were looking into the oil shippers who had been able to obtain some of the government ships that had been used during World War II. And they weren't supposed to go to foreigners. They were only supposed to go to American businessmen. Somehow, Aristotle Onassis had been able to acquire several of the large ships. And this was a real no-no as far as the government was concerned. And so at one point, Onassis actually came into the country and was put in jail for a full day while they cleared out and figured out what to do with his ownership of these things, of these ships. And Kennedy was one of the people who went after Onassis, Bobby Kennedy. So that's way back then in the 1950s. And of course, at that time, his own brother was running for Congress and then eventually would run for president. So that tension between Kennedy family and Onassis goes back a long time. After John Kennedy was elected president, Onassis, who had been known to be with the big opera star, Maria Callas, got infatuated with Lee Radziwill. Lee Radziwill is the sister of Jackie Kennedy. She was married to a prince at that time, Prince Radziwill. So there was a lot of switching going on there. And Lee Radziwill and Onassis were an item, and she was often seen with him on the Christina, which was his big yacht. So what happened is after Kennedy was elected and Jackie Kennedy got pregnant, she gave birth to Patrick Kennedy, who died immediately. And she was really feeling down. She was in part upset because while she was pregnant, John Kennedy, as president, went over to Berlin, and we all remember Ich bin ein Berliner, and he took with him her sister, Lee Radziwill, and Jackie didn't go. So her sister, younger sister, was actually kind of acting as the first lady, and it was a real kind of tension between the two. What happened after Patrick died is that Lee Radziwill, who at that time was back with Onassis on the Christina, invited or asked Onassis if he would invite Jackie Kennedy to come on the Christina so she could relax and get away from all of the tension of being first lady. And she did. And so she was on the Christina, and she was photographed wearing a bikini.
Wow.
And that got into the press in the United States. And for the first time, Jackie Kennedy was coming under criticism. Up until then, she'd been the darling of the first lady and shown the White House, and just had been this super hero. So anyway, she began to get bad press, and she came home. And shortly thereafterwards was when John Kennedy, the president, took the trip to Dallas. And of course, we know what happened then. But during that period of time when Jackie Kennedy was on the Christina, she apparently warmed up to Onassis and found him quite charming. And apparently they had some kind of interaction that was familial and warm and so on. And so she and he thought of themselves then as possibly down the line as getting together.
All right. So John Kennedy was also known as a womanizer too.
Yes.
while he was married to Jackie.
Oh, yeah.
So this was well known that John was
She knew
seeing,
it. Yeah.
and she knew it too. Did he know that Jackie was seeing others?
I don't know that she knew, and in fact, it's not been established for certain that they were lovers, that Jackie and Onassis were lovers before they got married.
Okay.
One biographer of Onassis claims that did happen while they were there, and another one says they just don't know. But in any case, Jack Kennedy knew, the president knew, was that she was being criticized, and she was off on the yacht with Onassis. And instead of being in Washington as a first lady and doing the job that first lady is expected, she, of course, was trying to recover from having lost her baby. But still, there was a limit to what kind of vacation she should be allowed to take, given the fact that she was First Lady of the United States.
Now, I'm not a conspiracy guy, and obviously there's a bazillion conspiracies around the Kennedy assassination in 1963. Was Onassis ever linked to it?
Not to the Kennedy assassination in 1963.
Just didn't know if they were trying to kill him off so he could have a clear path to Jackie.
No, there wasn't that in 1963. I mean, that was later. One of the biographers indicated that Onassis may have been indirectly responsible for the payments that went to Saran, who killed Bobby Kennedy.
Oh, wow. That's interesting because Bobby Kennedy was a public opponent of relations between Jackie, his brother's widow, and Aristotle Onassis.
Yes, that's true. And as a matter of fact, Bobby, after Jack Kennedy died, then Jackie Kennedy wanted to marry Onassis, in part because she was attracted to him, according to the biographers, and in part because she thought that he could take care of her children. She was really afraid that after having gone for John Kennedy, and then after Bobby Kennedy was assassinated, she was really afraid, and of course, shortly thereafter did in fact marry Onassis. He and Bobby Kennedy had their issues, and it was Bobby Kennedy who was preventing the marriage between Onassis and Jackie Kennedy. Bobby Kennedy said, okay, to Jackie, once I get elected president, okay. But in the meantime, it would not work for this campaign, which she agreed to. So that's kind of how the whole thing worked out.
Wow. This is fantastic. I can't imagine what the tabloids would have been like back in 1968, which I believe when Bobby Kennedy was killed. All right. So now let's actually get to the story.
Kind of peripheral to the whole issue here.
I know. I just love that stuff. So Olympic Refinery, led by Onassis, would identify Durham Point, New Hampshire, as the perfect, ideal spot for building not only an oil refinery, but a massive oil refinery, the biggest in the world at the time, which the numbers here, it was $600 million then in 1973, which is $4.3 billion in 2025. And they were going to produce 400,000 barrels of oil per day. Why had they identified Durham Point as the perfect spot?
Once Peter Boras had brought together the governor and the publisher of the Union Leader, together with Constantine Gratsos, they said, okay, now we've got a state and we've got support of the governor, we've got support of the major media. So this looks like it's going to be a cakewalk, but we got to find a good place to do it. So they looked where they could find it, who could find a good place in New Hampshire. We think, by we, I mean a lot of people afterwards think that maybe they somehow misinterpreted in thinking that the Piscataqua River or that the Great Bay was freshwater. But in any case, what they did is they took a helicopter ride over all of the state. And they said, well, this looks really good because you've got the Isles of Shoals, 9 miles off, and you could have your humongous tankers come and dock near the Isles of Shoals or at the Isles of Shoals, one of the isles, Lungeon Island, for example. They could pipe the oil underwater to Rye, Then from Rye, it would go overground through what was then Pease Air Force Base, across Great Bay, and into the Durham Point in New Hampshire. And that looked like a really good way to do it. There were some questions about where they were going to get fresh water that were later raised, because initial estimates of they needed somewhere around 6,000 gallons of water per minute, fresh water per minute. That was cut down quite substantially once they got to the public presentation, but initially that was what the plan called for. And it wasn't clear where they would get the fresh water. Lamprey River, the Oyster River, they're going to pipe it down from Lake Winnipesaukee. But in any case, as you pointed out, 400,000 barrels of oil a day that would be pumped in. Then there was a question, okay, what are you going to do with the oil once you've got it refined? They had these humongous storage tanks that were going to be set up all around the oil refinery in Durham. And then, although they denied it, Oil Olympic eventually would have led to a lot of other businesses dealing with oil. So that was the nature of the proposal, this humongous oil refinery, the largest in the world at that time.
And why were Governor Thompson and William Loeb of the Manchester Union Leader, why were they so insistent on getting a refinery here?
They claimed, it's hard to say for sure, because sometimes they're as opaque as Trump is today. You just never quite sure. All you know is what they want. But they claimed at the time that it would bring good economic benefits to the state, that it would bring a lot of construction, it would bring all these petrochemical plants and businesses, which of course would be like a certain part of New Jersey across from New York, or like Houston. It's not necessarily good from an environmental point of view. In fact, it's disastrous. But from a financial point of view, they thought it would help the state.
Jobs created, economy stimulated.
Yes. And the promises besides that, of course, for the Durham, was that they would reduce their tax rate because they could tax the oil refinery.
Yes, of course. It always comes back to taxes. Now, the book starts with a really fascinating scene. So this would never happen today. Imagine just a Greek businessman in a suit and top hat just going around knocking on doors in a neighborhood. And so one of these guys who is affiliated with Aristotle Onassis knocks on the door of Nancy Sandberg, who was one of the three women who was integral in stopping all of this refinery business from happening. What happens when this guy knocks on Nancy's door on this night in 1973?
Well, actually, he doesn't quite knock on her door. She's outside already. And she's got her, her hair is mussed and everything. And she sees him drive up to her door, and he comes up to knock on her door. But she walks over and says, what are you doing? And so he starts asking her. He knows all sorts of things about her. He knows that she doesn't own it, that it belongs to her father. He knows what the tax rate is. He knows that she owns another piece of property. He knows all these kinds of things, which of course is a little creepy, when somebody comes up like that, this person, and he wants to buy some property from her. And she said she can't sell it. It's not hers. He says, I know it's not yours. So she refuses. So he says, I'd like to talk to your husband. This is, she says, well, he's preparing for school. He's a school teacher in Exeter. And that's where he was preparing, because it was in the fall, right before the start of school. So he said, I want to talk to him. She said, just to get rid of him, she finally said, okay, you can come on Saturday when he's here. And of course, he came on Saturday. Peter Boras came back on Saturday, and they recorded, thinking that this might be something that they could use or whatever. But it turns out he just said the same things. And you're right in a way. It's kind of creepy, because they were going throughout the neighborhood,
right.
Different people affiliated with the Olympic group, and they were all Greek, all kind of swarthy,
right.
And coming into this area and saying they wanted to buy it for a game preserve, or they wanted it for someone else who just wanted a family. They kept pretending it was for some essentially environmentally conscious, good project.
Right. And Nancy coordinated with the other neighbors and said, hey, has anyone been coming around asking to buy your property?
There was no Facebook or
she actually just posted on the Facebook neighborhood page.
So she called for a meeting and got got several of the neighbors to get together at the University of New Hampshire Library, and they talked about what was going on. And then eventually they decided, well, we better organize because this is clearly not something that, it's clearly not what they say it is. It looks like some great big development. They thought it was going to be a great big housing development or something like that. They had no idea it was going to be an oil refinery. But eventually they, after long discussions, they came up with the title Save Our Shores, just because it had SOS, and that was a nice acronym. They weren't sure if it was really the shores or whether it was the interior of the land, but it was a good acronym. So they had the organization. They didn't know what they were opposing.
Mm-hmm. And it is then at that point that Phyllis Bennett of Public Occurrences, a local publication, she's really central in uncovering what these guys from Greece were really up to.
Well, fortuitously, Phyllis Bennett and her husband, Steve, happened, just coincidentally, to have started a brand new local paper in Newmarket for the whole Seacoast area called Public Occurrences. That paper had first been published in the 1800s for one edition, and then the publisher was thrown into jail. So
I love that.
So they started the second edition, that they started in August. And at that point, that was the only newspaper that was going to cover what was happening locally. Foster's Daily Democrat and the Portsmouth Herald didn't cover that kind of information.
Why not?
Well, they didn't know too much about what was happening. They were, mostly focused on Dover. It wasn't at Dover and it wasn't at Portsmouth. This was in Durham. And there was no really local paper for the Seacoast area. There was a Hampton paper, but there was no Durham paper. There was no Newmarket paper. There was, things like that. And so this paper happened to discover that there were all of these efforts being made to buy property. And so October 9th, they published on the front page, quote, oil refinery in Durham, ? They didn't know if it was an oil refinery, but all of the secrecy combined with the efforts, the very public efforts by the governor to get an oil refinery made them wonder if this wasn't an oil refinery after all. So once they put that out on the newspaper, then it alerted everybody to the possibility this would be an oil refinery.
And once they were made aware of that possibility, what was the public's reaction?
Well, initially, the governor wouldn't admit that that's what it was all about. But eventually, within a few weeks, he did admit it. And it was a lot quicker than they wanted it to be admitted. Number one, it got out before all the property options had been obtained, which meant that the price for the options were much higher after that news came out. It also meant that the Olympic Refinery people, the group that they had to study the details of where the refinery would go, what would happen, had not been worked out. And so before they were even really ready, they were being pressed to answer questions. It put them under a lot of pressure, which was good. It was good because they didn't have the answers right away. So that made them look bad, and they had a lot of bad publicity for that. So generally, the public reaction in Durham was initially, this could be good by many people. This might raise property taxes. And then as SOS began developing studies done by the UNH professors and got more investigation into what an oil refinery would be, how big it would be, how many oil spills are typically found with oil refineries, all that information eventually got published in Public Occurrences. So eventually, in the town of Durham, the opposition grew to be substantial against the oil refinery.
Coming up, the quirky rule that eventually drove Onassis out of town, and how the Seacoast would look drastically different had he succeeded. That's in a moment, but first, I want to tell you a different story. In December, I went to lunch with Art and Jen Meconi. Before then, I didn't know much about them or what they did. I knew it was something in the financial realm, which I'm not well versed in. So naturally, I was nervous for the conversation because, as you can tell from this podcast, I can talk to yoga teachers and coffee shop owners all day about their businesses. But I don't know the first thing about mortgages, buying bonds, financial planning, etc. But as we started talking, I felt at ease with them. They're fans of the show, and they asked about me and my story, which really meant a lot. Meconi Financial Management and Advisory is a comprehensive financial planning practice with locations in Bedford and Portsmouth, and their dedicated team cares about giving their clients the highest levels of client services on the Seacoast. The Meconis do things differently, and they also love this area. They host events downtown, and they also sponsored our first live podcast in January, and we're proud to partner with them again this month on Seacoast Stories. The Meconis hope to empower their clients to achieve their financial goals, and I know firsthand that they will do whatever it takes to get you there. To learn more about their services, just visit the link in the show notes. Speaking of subjects I don't know much about, ladies, let me tell you about your hormones. Or rather, let me tell you about a wonderful friend of mine who is an expert in hormones. Dr. Whitney L. Sesser is a doctor of nursing practice and certified nurse midwife who specializes in hormone health, fertility, and functional medicine. In her practice, Holistic and Hormonal, is a virtual women's health and hormone-focused practice which services women in New Hampshire and Maine. Obviously, I don't know much about all this, but I can tell you that talk about hormones is showing up all over my algorithms these days. I don't know what that says about me, but many of my female yogi friends are passionate about it and we talk about it, so I imagine this stuff is very important. With her functional medicine approach, Dr. Whitney helps you get to the root cause of your issues. Instead of taking a pill for your mood swings, maybe you just need to balance your hormones, and she will help coach you through the safest ways to do that. Ditto for addressing fertility struggles, weight challenges, and more. And over the next month, she is offering our listeners free lab consultations. Just visit holisticandhormonal.org and on the contact page, write the word hormones, and she'll get in touch with you for more details. Thank you to Holistic and Hormonal and Meconi Financial for supporting the show. Now back to today's story. You mentioned oil spills, one big concern of those who opposed the oil refinery. What were some of their, what's the ecological impact of an oil spill? And then B, what were some of their other concerns?
Well, they had various studies that were done by the UNH professors, and before Olympic refineries had gotten around to it. And one of the studies indicated that something like 1 part of oil per million could devastate the fishing industry along the coast, all the way to Cape Ann. And the reason is they estimated the number of barrels of oil that would be leaked, inevitably leaked, based upon other oil refineries and how often the leaks were. So the net conclusion was that if the oil refinery were even half the size, it would devastate the lobster industry and seriously curtail the rest of the fishing industry. Who wants to, eat fresh fish that have been contaminated by oil? It also was something that would possibly hurt the tourist industry in the Seacoast tourist industry.
Did we have a big tourist industry then?
Oh, yeah. A lot of Canadians and a lot of, they're cold up there.
Yeah. Well, I'm just curious because I've heard that Portsmouth in the 70s was nothing. It was actually quite scary and unsafe. So I don't know if the rest of the Seacoast was more appealing than Portsmouth was.
Well, Hampton Beach, Rye Beach, they were, and the whole beach area. It's only 18 miles of coast,
right?
So it's a pretty small. But for the Seacoast area, it was a big deal. Yeah, the tourist industry was. So the tourist industry and the fishing industry would have been decimated.
Why would an oil refinery drive away tourist industry? Because they wouldn't come eat the lobster?
Well, as it turns out, in order to build the pipeline to Rye, they would have to blow up the beach. That's one of the scenes that convinced the people in Rye that this was a real devastation. Rye was a very important part of the plan because of the oil is going to the oil refinery would be piped underwater to a port in Rye. So at one point, a resident of Rye, who was also a pilot, Kit Baker, talked to the selectman in Rye and said, I fly out of New York. When I'm down in New York, why don't I visit Olympic Oil Refinery office and see what I can find out? They said, that'd be great. So he went down to New York and he went to the office. He told him he was interested in what was going on. He said, well, we're kind of busy, but we'll show you this video or this film that we have of how we put in the pipe into another place in Saudi Arabia. He said, okay. And so he watched the film. And afterwards, he came out, his eyes wide open and said, when you come to Rye to talk about the oil refinery, be sure you bring that film to show them. He said, okay, we will. So when Rye had its big meeting to discuss what would be going on, that film was shown. And what it showed is they had some really nice music. And then all of a sudden there was a humongous blast. Boom. And it showed how they had to dynamite the beach area in order to be able to create a pipeline and a port. And once they dynamited, once they showed that film, then everybody, of course, in Rye. And if nobody could figure out why they would have brought that film along, not knowing that Kit Baker had encouraged them to, with a very explicit understanding that it would have that specific effect.
Wow. Okay. So once Onassis, Thompson, Loeb, who are, on the front lines of wanting to build this refinery, once they caught wind that the residents of Durham were protesting and rebelling and banding together, voicing opposition against this refinery, how did these guys respond?
Well, first of all, we have to back up a little bit to talk about Dudley, because when the information came out that it might be an oil refinery, she immediately started talking with other representatives. And the real question was whether or not the state would allow the town to have what they call home rule. If the town said no, are you going to force it on the town anyway? So her objective was to make sure that any legislation that was passed to deal with an oil refinery would not impose an oil refinery on any town that didn't want it.
Okay.
That's just a home rule. So that was what Dudley was doing in the legislature, working with Chris Spiro, who was the assistant minority leader at the time.
For home rule to take effect, is there a percentage of Durham residents need to be for or against this?
Home rule is not it's a tradition. It's a custom.
Okay. It's not quantifiable.
It's not a rule.
Okay.
It's not really a rule. It's just home rule means that the individual towns should be able to rule or to have their own laws.
Okay, got it.
And we see that being threatened, right now by the state that wants to. Let me see. Do I want to say that? I don't mind saying it if I can think of what it is they're trying to do. Oh, they're trying to do it in education. But anyway, I won't go there.
Okay.
So home rule is not a rule. It's just a tradition where local towns have control, particularly over zoning regulations.
Okay. The bigger players, though, their case for having this here, obviously, they want to make a bunch of money. That's obviously Onassis's interest. But the justification and the pushback that they gave, correct me if I'm wrong, was this will be good for the economy. This will be good for you guys. This is a win for you guys. Your taxes will be lower, right? These were some of the things that they were saying.
Yeah, and the governor and the union leader with William Loeb writing the editorials would make the argument that this was good for New Hampshire and that we shouldn't allow one small town to thwart the economic advantages that this would bring to New Hampshire. That was the argument. Initially, Governor Thompson said he was never going to enforce a refinery on a town that didn't want it. But behind the scenes, he was supporting the efforts that would support that amendment.
Wait, you mean there was a politician not sticking to his word?
Yeah, there was.
Wow.
There were things going on, initially, Olympic said, they would not force it on anybody, but they were working very closely with the legislators to set up the oil refinery, that it would be under the Energy Committee, and that the final say would be made by that Energy Committee rather than by any local group. And that was what the real battle was for, that Durham could say no and they would respect that. That was what the battle was for.
Take me back into the context of the media. So I grew up in a media family, and so you're supposed to be down the middle, and you're not really supposed to be currying favor with multi-bazillionaires from other countries. So I find it so fascinating that William Loeb of the Manchester Union Leader is choosing a side when really you should not be choosing any sides in big debates.
Well, when William Loeb started out in an early age trying to buy up various newspapers, and he got a hold of one in Vermont, and he got two in Vermont. His notion of newspapers was not to report the news, but to make the news. That was his notion from the beginning. That's what he wanted to do. And eventually he was able to get the Union Leader. And in the book, I go through, quite a bit of the detail about how he acquired that. But right from the beginning, his editorials, front page editorials, were slanted in a very particular super conservative direction. And the newspaper itself, the stories themselves were shaded that way as well. He's kind of like Rupert Murdoch, only before Rupert Murdoch.
Interesting.
And this is what he envisioned for his newspapers.
And how powerful was the Manchester Union Leader in terms of New Hampshire media outlets at this time?
Well, it was the only statewide newspaper, the only one that was distributed statewide. And it, in fact, like any bullying kind of situation, was very effective. There's a lot to talk about with respect to the Union Leader and how effective it was. But I can say, just as far as it applies to this situation, William Loeb was able to get Meldrum Thompson elected governor. He tried several times and finally got Thompson elected governor. Loeb went after people, went after politicians, went after their families. He caused the governor's daughter to have a psychological breakdown, a nervous breakdown, because he went after her personally. She had at one point said, when she was in Maryland, and some newspaper had asked her what she thought of marijuana, and she said she didn't know much about it, but a lot of people seem to enjoy it. And as a consequence of that, the Loeb used that incident to go after her ferociously. She had to skip her senior year in high school. She eventually came back, but that was the bullying type. He was what Trump is today. He just bullied everybody. And that worked, just as Trump has worked.
That just makes this underdog story even more incredible. You said this isn't a David versus Goliath story. What was the phrase that you used? There was something in the book, like it was like 10x David versus Goliath, because you're not only dealing with the richest man in the world, you're also dealing with the media in the States trying to manipulate the people into believing that this refinery was a net positive. Pretty crazy.
Yeah.
So the residents of Durham, what tools were they using? So home rule they were trying to invoke. What other kinds of boots on the ground, bootstrapping campaigns were they running to really try to get this dead in the tracks?
Well, initially, the argument was going to be environmental. This would really be devastating to the environment, given the oil spills and given the fragile ecology system that existed in the Great Bay. It's a combination, of salt water and fresh water. So it's a very special kind of system. But it was very clearly and very early recognized that making the environmental argument wouldn't be very persuasive, in part because of the economy, in part because the governor and Loeb didn't care much about the environment.
It's not sexy.
Yeah, no. So it had to come down to home rule. The problem with home rule is that it might work for Durham. Durham doesn't get to Durham can say no, and so they don't build it in Durham. But suppose they move right down the road to Newmarket. And if Newmarket voted for it, maybe Newmarket would take it, or Rochester, which seemed to be favorable toward it at the time. So it was not, as Dudley would say, the finest approach. Better would have been an environmental argument, but they didn't make that. They couldn't make that argument for the reasons that I've said before, is that really people would be most persuaded by an economic argument or some other kind of argument. Would it bring more jobs? They were talking about 15,000 new jobs. And the answer was, at best, it might bring 1,000 jobs temporarily while they're building the refinery. But after that, any jobs that were there would be jobs for people who are already in the oil industry. That was very technical. And the third promise they had was that it would bring more oil and gas to New Hampshire, to the town itself, and to the state.
And during this crisis.
During this crisis, that was a very strong argument. But as it turns out, oil and energy in general is distributed in the United States on a regional basis by the federal government. New Hampshire would not get any special deal. As a matter of fact, the gas lines were as long in New Jersey and in Houston, where they had oil refineries, as they were in New Hampshire.
Right. And a common refrain, this was funny throughout the book because I also hate New Jersey, was the Durham residents were saying, don't make us be another New Jersey.
That's right. Which is unfortunate because having lived in New Jersey, or at least temporarily, there are many parts of New Jersey that are just actually beautiful.
Yes.
But, that's why it's called the Garden State.
Yes.
So I have to say that just to kind of defend New Jersey.
Well, thank you. We appreciate that. All right. So we won't spoil the ending in terms of how the women and the residents of Durham actually get or actually stop this project from going through. You can find Small Town Big Oil on shelves at the Water Street Bookstore in Exeter, at the brand new Book Nook in Portsmouth, also at the Barnes & Noble in Newington, and then, of course, a little online bookstore called Amazon.com. David, I want to ask you some hypotheticals. Had this refinery gotten approved, gotten built, and operated on the Seacoast, how different would the Seacoast look today?
It's really hard to imagine what this situation would look like today. What we do know is if we take a look at Newark, New Jersey, if we take a look at Houston, or you take a look at other places where there are refineries and all the petrochemical plants, this area would not be recognizable to anybody who lived during that period. Now you can still see the coast. You can see the beautiful coastline. You can appreciate the environment. You can appreciate Great Bay. You can appreciate the beaches. But all of that would have been really devastated by an oil refinery.
Rye Beach would not exist. The lobster industry would not be as big as it is.
It's hard to say whether it could have even exist, the lobster industry, because of the oil spills.
Yeah.
I'm not an ecologist. Right. I'm not a fisherman or anything, and I don't know how much the lobsters would be able to survive in oil spills that would have been that significant.
Yeah. And then just as for the natural beauty of the Seacoast.
Oh, it's just mind-blowing to think how badly the situation would be today, how bad it would be.
Wow. If a similar situation were to play out today, where the world's richest man, where Elon Musk, Jeff Bezos, Mark Zuckerberg, the list goes on, they want to build a huge crypto mining farm, which is also another environmental disaster. And they wanted to do it on the Seacoast because Durham Point was the perfect point. And the residents of Portsmouth and Durham and Dover all banded together to say, this is a terrible idea. We can't allow this to happen. Do you think we would be able to successfully in 2025 fend off the world's richest people from having their way with us?
The media environment would be different, obviously, because people would know quite soon, and
People around the world would be invested too.
Not sure that the respect for home rule today is as strong as it was then. You see the government, you see the states right now, they're passing laws that affect how towns can rent their property. It's going again. Durham has a limit because they've got so many students, so they have laws that limit how many unrelated people can live together to prevent the residential area from being one of just a lot of student rentals. And I think there are bills right now that are trying to override that kind of home rule law. There are also bills that are dealing with education. Education is, mostly town supported. And yet I read that, the state is now ordering, the Department of Education is now ordering the local schools around the state to abide by the anti-DEI instructions from the Trump administration. So these are violations, clear violations of home rule. And it was home rule that ultimately saved Durham from the oil refinery. From the oil refinery point of view, it was a good deal. It was fortuitous that Olympic didn't try to go someplace else. Once they got defeated in Durham, that was it. They didn't try to go someplace else. So the home rule issue helped the state, I think, and it certainly helped Durham. But these days, it does seem as though with the partisan nature, the real extreme partisanship, that the legislature will do what it can do, regardless of tradition or custom.
Do you think there's any positive takeaways that we can take from this experience? And, it worked in 1973. It can work in 2025. Any lessons that we today can take away from this?
Well, I do think that the environment is different and it's tougher, but I do think the model of organizing at the local level is really very crucial. You have to get the support out there. If the town had not organized the way that it did, and if the other towns had not organized also, then I think the state legislature would have gone. But we see some vague hope that the protests today are having an effect. And I do think that unless there is widespread protest, in 1973 in the fall, when they were trying to put in the oil refinery, if there hadn't been the protests, then I think we would have had the oil refinery. So I'm not completely pessimistic. I do think that public protests can be effective.
Yeah. So you published this book in 2018. I've told several people in my life about this conversation because I'm so giddy about the Seacoast. I'm almost 2 years into living here, so I'm still learning all of the things. And I've asked lifelong New Hampshire residents, have you heard of this book? Are you familiar with the story? Most of them, 90% of them, have not been familiar. As you were researching this book, publishing this book, and then since publishing this book, have you found that no one really knows about this?
Yes, I wouldn't say no one, but I do say, most of the people are kind of in my generation, the ones who were around. But yes, it is startling, and it's probably startling to everybody who gets old when they look back at the time and they say, gee, they don't remember World War II. We don't remember World War. So I don't think it's unusual that people don't know. But it is a major story, and I hope the book helps keep the story alive. There is a movie organization that's looking at possibly making a movie out of it.
Oh, there's a great movie to be had here.
And I'm working on a play that I hope will be able to be used. The book is one thing, but if it can be a play that could be played from time to time in the schools and so on, that would be another way to keep the memory alive of how important it was that the oil refinery be defeated and how different the world would be today here if we had that oil refinery.
Yeah, I don't watch movies, as the listeners know, but if this movie came out, I would certainly flock to Fox Run Mall to go to the theaters there.
Or stream it.
Or stream it. All right, I suppose that is what the kids do nowadays. On this, how did you get interested in writing this book? Obviously, there's a bazillion different rabbit holes you can go down for books. I'm sure you have a million ideas. So why did you want to pursue this one?
In 2014 was the 40th anniversary of the defeat of the oil refinery. And the town of Durham got a lot of the people together who had been involved in there. And I went to that presentation and I was really impressed. Of course, I was actually living in Lee at the time that it happened. I was teaching at the University of New Hampshire.
And you were following this as this was happening?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah, so I was definitely aware of it. And so at the 40th anniversary, I said, well, it's very interesting that we have all of these oral memories, but it seemed to me that it would be worthwhile writing a book about it. So then that's when I started interviewing Phyllis and Nancy and Dudley, and then as many other people who were involved that I could find.
Yeah, that's so cool that so many of those people were still living and that you had the opportunity to talk to them.
And the public occurrences, was on file, and there was so much information in public occurrences that chronicled what was happening at the time. And then, of course, I went to the Union Leader, and then even to Foster's Daily Democrat to look at the archives there, and went to the Boston Globe because that was ultimately a small factor in the thing. So, looking at all those areas, you could find a lot of information about what actually happened.
What was the most fulfilling part for you in writing this book?
I think afterwards, after it was written, and Dudley and Nancy and Phyllis's family, by then Phyllis had passed away, particularly Phyllis's family, but Dudley's family and also Nancy's, that they read the book and they thought that it was a good portrayal that I'd captured of their feelings as well as the times of that period. So their reaction to it meant that you can never know when you write something like that, whether somebody's going to say, well, you forgot this, you forgot that, you really distorted this. But I got mostly positive reactions from it. And that was gratifying because I think the story itself is so important.
It is an important story and it is so well written. Again, the book is Small Town, Big Oil, the untold story of the women who took on the richest man in the world and won. Professor Moore, thank you so much for joining me on the show today. We have one final question, and we ask this same final question at the end of every episode every week, and I'll ask it to you. Knowing what you know now, in hindsight, about how your life has turned out, what advice would you give to your younger 22-year-old self?
I don't give advice to 22-year-olds. Everybody's got to live their own life and make their own mistakes, find their own thing.
No regrets?
No, that would be wrong. Of course I have regrets. How can anybody go through life and not say at one time or another, boy, I wish I'd done that rather than what I did do, or if I had done. So, of course, we all have regrets, but you don't dwell on them. You go forward. And, if somebody asked me for advice, I would give them tentative advice, but I would not presume to think that I can help anybody live their life better than they can.
Well, this is advice to yourself. Were you, a lot of the advice that people give themselves is calm down. Everything's going to work out. Trust the path that you're on. Like, I know you're freaking out because in the context of a 22-year-old, you're fresh out of college. The world is your oyster, but you're unsure of yourself and what you want your life to look like. Bunch of balls are up in the air. Anything come to mind?
Well, all I can say is that if I were so presumptuous as to try to give my former self advice, my former self would probably say, buzz off. That's who I am. So, I know you're trying to get me to say something along the way of advice, but sorry, I can't comply.
All right. I dig it. Home rule wins out again.
Yeah.
Professor Moore, thank you so much for joining me. I really appreciate it.
I enjoyed it, Troy. Thanks.
That's Professor David W. Moore of UNH. If you enjoyed this Seacoast History Deep Dive, then please let us know by leaving a review of the show on Apple Podcasts. And if you hated it more than I hate trying to find a parking spot in Portsmouth, then please let us know that as well. That's it for this week, and I'm skipping town on Friday. So if you see me before then, perhaps at Noah Cafe, the Black Birch, or the Wilder, then please stop me and say hi. I would love to hear your story. Until next Monday, everybody, have a great week. Live free or die.